right, on the show today, Elaine Beaumont and Chris Irons. They are compassion-focused therapists. That's the therapy with compassion. Who would have thought of it? Sounds like a good idea, right? And I heard very good things about them and the books and different things they're doing. So I was curious and I thought, let's get them on. So Elaine and Chris, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
And you're both in the UK at the moment. But Chris, I think you said you're going to be moving to Portugal, like I will be soon. So that's where you are now. How did you get there? Like, what was the beginning of your journey with compassion and therapy? Either of you jump in.
Elaine, do you want to kick off?
I was doing an awful lot of kind of trauma work as a therapist, I think, and kind of traditional cognitive behavioural therapy, and really working with a lot of people that had high levels of shame and self-criticism. A lot of the people were the kind of first responders in Greater Manchester. Sadly, I'm not going to Portugal. I'll be staying in Salford. But so yeah, and kind of working with the first responders, fire brigade, nurses. Really wanted to do something else, try something else other than just kind of traditional CBT, and compassion-focused therapy was kind of on my radar. And I just got into a lot of training. I'm also a lecturer, so it was really important to kind of do some of the stuff regarding kind of CFT with some of the students as well. So yeah, that's how I got into it, because I just wanted to kind of increase my tool bag and learn different therapies for different modalities, you know, for different people struggling with different issues. How about you, Chris?
Mine's a slightly different route, really. As you know, Mark, compassion-focused therapy is the brainchild of Professor Paul Gilbert. So for those of you who don't know, Paul is a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology. And Paul's been working on the ideas behind this model for the best part of 40 years. And I was very lucky as an undergrad psychology student back in 1999. I had to go on a work placement, and I was, it's fair to say, a little bit unorganized, and through serendipity ended up meeting Paul and seeing if I could have a year-long work placement with him, and that happened. And so that was 22 years ago, basically. I landed on Paul's doorstep, and it's just been this fantastic ride, really, because I was involved with Paul in doing some work and looking at attachment theory, shame, self-criticism, the early work in terms of compassion stuff. We published some papers on compassion-focused imagery. That was in 2004, seeing how people could create images of compassionate others that could be helpful for them when they're struggling and they're suffering with depression and self-criticism. And then from there, really just working together to support Paul, really, in developing this wonderful model, which has, you know, really taken a pace. And
taken off. It's pretty well known now. And when I ask a question, I'd like to either of you, feel free to jump in.
Sure.
You know, people listening to this, some may be therapists, but a lot will be yoga teachers, meditators, martial artists, you know, different people mindfulness and different things. It sounds like, well, of course, compassionate. You know, shouldn't all therapy be compassionate focused? Isn't that sort of the heart of it? Like, let's go right back to basics. Why does it need a name?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell a bit of that story, really. One of the bits is, I often get this when I'm teaching, you know, people say, why are you calling your therapy compassion focused? All therapies are compassionate. Well, that's a kind of interesting thing that we could debate. Are all therapies as equally as compassionate? But that's not really the point. The point is the compassion focused bit is how compassion orientates textures and colors, the various things that you might do in the psychotherapeutic relationship. So how would having a compassionate understanding influence the therapeutic relationship? How you ask questions, how you go about setting behavioral tasks, doing chair work, doing imagery, doing lots of practices that we would do in many different therapies. So it's a little bit like how you would use this as the lens through which you orientate a lot of your work. And the other thing just to say is that compassion is one of those words, Mark, that you're probably aware of, that people use all the time. But when you actually ask them, what does this actually mean? It can be quite a tricky word, actually. And so there's a lot of work and science that's gone on to try to understand this and see how compassion operates in the mind and body.
Elaine, do you want to pick up what compassion is then, if you fancy that one, because it's maybe worth drilling into?
Well, I suppose it takes courage, and there's a wisdom and a strength and a commitment. Often people will see words like compassion or kindness and think of things like, oh, it sounds quite fluffy. But actually it's not. It's tough. It's tough, you know, particularly when people are struggling with issues regarding mental health or just general struggles in life. You know, facing some of those difficulties sometimes it does take a lot of courage and strength and wisdom. And those are some of the core components within compassion focused therapy that we focus on. You know, how can we help people to kind of cultivate a compassionate mind and build courage and have the strength and the wisdom in order to navigate challenges.
And does it come from a Buddhist background, like kind of, you know, mindfulness being extracted from Buddhism? Is it sort of coming from, you know, the Brahma-viharas, the heart practices in Buddhism, or is it kind of a whole separate body of thing?
There's certainly a flavor of that. Certainly CFT has been influenced by Buddhist psychology, Buddhist practices, but CFT is also orientated in a broad range of sciences. For example, we have the capacity to be compassionate to others and to self because we have an evolved capacity to be caring. So mammals have been in the world for 200 million years, and mammals evolved to be able to be caring and orientated to the distress and the needs of their offspring. So the capacity for us to be compassionate partly comes from a very long lineage that we have the capacity to be caring to each other, and that actually our caring capacity is the thing that evolved to regulate distress. So if you think about it, if a baby is distressed, what is the thing that settles them? Well, it is the caring capacity of the parent or a caregiver, which helps to settle or meet their needs and settle their distress. So compassion is rooted in this very ancient, evolved motive to be caring. In this sense, it overlaps quite nicely with Steve Porges' work on polyvagal theory. But the difference with compassion to caring is that compassion also brings what we refer to these new brain competencies. So this prefrontal ability that we have to be able to think and imagine and mentalize and empathize. And so you bring this ancient motive plus these amazing human abilities that we have to tune our minds in to be a certain way. And then, of course, that leads to what we call compassion, which essentially has two components, Mark. One is that you notice and you're sensitive to suffering and distress. And the second thing is that you take wise action. So you find ways to try to alleviate or be with that distress, whether it's in somebody else or whether it's in yourself.
Right. So I was just in my men's marketing group before this, and it's pretty business focused. But there was one guy who just didn't look very happy. And I know him quite well. I said, I won't use his name, but I said, let's call him John. I said, John, are you okay? Because I noticed he didn't seem quite himself, not much affect, you know, in his face. And he said, actually, no, and then shared a very personal story about his girlfriend. And then the group kind of naturally was like, you know, is there anything I can do? Do you want to talk about it? You know, and so there's the sort of two parts, right? The kind of sensitivity to it, the resonance, because it's not just a cognitive thing, right? It's not, there's a like, oh, my friend's hurting, you know, there's a resonance there. And then some, not just like feeling, oh, really empathic, some desire to actually help, right? The second part.
Yeah, it's a perfect example, really, Mark. And two things just to say there. Number one, because CFT is orientated in evolutionary understanding, what we also recognize is that we do have different motives. So we have a competitive motive where we can try to, maybe that was the motive that the group were more in because you were thinking about and developing ideas. But one of the interesting things is how able are we to switch motives? Can we switch between being orientated and getting things and doing things, and then switch to being sensitive to suffering? So what you described there is perfect. The key thing for us, though, in these two parts of compassion is that both of those parts can be blocked or inhibited. Okay. So of course, if you hadn't noticed his suffering, if you hadn't noticed flat affect and his lack of facial expression, then you might not have responded in a different way. You might have just continued with your meeting.
Yeah, walked all over it. I want to come back to that, but let me jump in. So
yeah,
you mentioned evolution. So there was a story told about evolution, that sort of nature, tooth and claw, we're all out to get each other. And then, as you said, it doesn't really apply to mammals. And, you know, if a baby's crying, we don't give it a yoga technique. We pick it up and we co-regulate, right? The Borges stuff. And see the modern climate, people not being able to see each other's faces or not have as much touch as they might. Well, that co-regulation has been really shat on, hasn't it? And I go, many cases. And I kind of go, it's pretty important that we as a species understand that our nature is caring and co-regulatory. That's important for social policy, for well-being. Like, Elaine, like, that is a critical part of who we are, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's also important as well, particularly from in a sort of therapeutic setting, I guess, to kind of talk as well, Chris, if you agree with this about our tricky brain, how we often get caught up in these kind of thinking, feeling loops. And part of that is as a response to kind of evolution and, our kind of experiences and, the things that we just inherit as human beings. So it can be really, really tricky and difficult. But part of that is kind of the education that I guess we all just find ourselves here, born into a country and a culture that we don't choose and into a family that we don't choose. And how we would be a different version of who we are if we were born to our next door neighbours. But this is just one version that we see. We can cultivate a future self, a different version potentially.
Yeah, I wouldn't have chosen to be born in the English weather for sure. It's much nicer here in Lisbon. But so it seems like it's two things, both an inherent quality, like I've seen quite young children, offer you half their cookie or something, quite compassionately, because they think you're hungry. And it also is a skill though, right? There seems to be people who are naturals, and there are people who learn to be better at this, like, some of the Buddhists or whoever it is. Like, so it's both, right? It's an inherent thing and a skill. Would you agree? Or
yeah, exactly. So there's two things. One I would argue that actually, and I guess in CFT we would argue that, we're born with many different competencies or many different abilities, and it depends on what grows really and what you feed. So it's not that we're inherently good or bad. I don't particularly like those labels, but it's not that we're only caring and compassionate or only harmful and competitive. We have inside of us, through evolutionary processes, all of those capabilities. What version of that plays through, what pattern of that comes through, is then, as you say, Mark, into this whole thing about the sort of social shaping. What do you get from your culture? What do you get from your family? What do you get from your peers? What do you get from your school? And this, of course, pulls on some of these different abilities in different ways. So we all have the capacity to be very, very compassionate and caring to ourselves and others. Whether that actually comes to the foreground or not, whether that's the version of you, yeah, that's very much dependent on what you've experienced and what has been primed. But then secondly, even if that hasn't been primed, some of the wonderful research now, of course, is showing is that this can be cultivated like a skill, like a muscle. You can work this out and cultivate it. And I think this is so important because we have an assumption, and this is having worked in the healthcare service for a very long time and as a therapist, that therapists and clinicians have a high level of compassion that is there every single day, that it doesn't get changed no matter what happens around you, and that this is an intrinsic quality of you that you can't train and cultivate. And
mine goes down if I haven't had dinner, Chris. If I haven't eaten in 5 hours, mine goes down for sure.
Exactly, that all these things change and shape your capacity to be empathetic and compassionate, and that actually we can all train our abilities to be better at being caring and compassionate to others, and crucially to ourselves.
Right. I think the cultural piece is very interesting. I travel a lot, and there's definitely places where it's more normal to be more compassionate, and that's a skill that's more culturally trained. There's places I've been at, Tibetan Buddhist communities, where it's just people, even the people that weren't doing any meditation or anything, it was just part of the culture to be very kind in that way. And then, then there's harsh places like Manchester, Elaine, as well. On the other end of the spectrum is Mordor, Manchester, those kind of places. And it's the cultural piece I find interesting, because we as a culture can choose to encourage this or not, right? Like we can say this is important to us as a people.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I don't know if you've heard, there's in the UK, Mark, there's this wonderful group called Compassion in Politics. And what they're trying to do is really prime the political discourse of whichever party you're from, to try to treat each other with respect, to try to develop policies that are helpful, not harmful. And the point is that we can train ourselves to try to be like this. And that rather, I mean, as therapists, I love being a therapist, but partly why Elaine and I have been trying to write these books and develop the self-compassion app and these things is, how do we get these ideas out of the therapy room? Because I can only see a limited number of people in my career. And how do we get it to more people? But even more than that, how do we start orientating organizations, schools, our businesses, and our countries actually to be more sensitive to distress and suffering, and trying to find ways to alleviate it? So yeah, very much that feels like this is an important thing over multiple levels, not just an individualistic thing that we're talking about here.
Remember when I realized that people more conservative than me were actually just as compassionate, they were just going about it in a different way. And I just always assumed they were stupid or evil. And then I kind of was like, oh shit. And that's still a point that I think is lost on most of my liberal friends, actually. But the idea that people with different views may be doing compassion in different ways, being compassionate people with different politics or different views on COVID. There's one, you know, at the moment.
Yeah.
What gets in the way then? Let's come back to this point. So why is it sometimes I'm a pretty nice guy, you know, helping old ladies across the road, looking after kids, stroking cats, feeding the homeless, you name it. I can be a bloody lovely guy and not to get something just out of the goodness of my heart, we might say. And other times I am an arsehole. Like my team will tell you this at work. There's times when I'm a nice boss and times when I'm not. And I am trying to be a nicer boss more of the time. But what gets in the way? Because I don't suddenly become a psychopath. I'm pretty sure I'm not a psychopath. So what happens? Why aren't I a nice boss all the time?
Well, I'll start off and then hand over to you, Elaine. So the first thing is that we wouldn't be asking somebody to be a compassionate person all the time. For example, if you're taking, I don't know, playing a football match and you've got the penalty kick in the last minute of the game, if you're overwhelmed by compassion for the goalkeeper at that moment, Mark, it's probably not the most helpful thing. It's good to be in a competitive motivation at the right time. It's, you know, so the point is can you fit the motive to fit the context? Now, when you are in a situation where you feel yourself moving away from being a caring, compassionate person, sometimes we have to hold that in mind. Is this okay to shift into something else? You know, if somebody's about to assault me or my son, I'm not going to be empathically reaching out and thinking about why are they doing this thing. I will be very much in threat system and in fight or flight and protecting myself and my loved one. So it's always, first of all, saying that you don't always have to be a compassionate person. In fact, we would say you shouldn't be a compassionate person all the time. Second thing is, though, is to recognize what we talk about in CFT is the fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion. So fears are, I would quite like to be more compassionate to myself or to others, but it makes me feel anxious or scared in some ways, that people would take advantage of me, or people will manipulate me, or something like that. I'll become too vulnerable. Exactly.
Yeah, got it. That's quite a strong narrative, isn't it? You've got to be tough as a boss or something.
Exactly. You know, people deserve punishment. They don't deserve compassion. And to give you a flavor of why this is so common, there's been often say, you know, something's common in life when a psychologist develops a questionnaire to measure it. And there is a questionnaire called the Fear of Compassion Scale, which measures fears of compassion to others, receiving compassion from others, and fear of self-compassion. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is blocks. So blocks to compassion are, I'm not scared of being compassionate, but something gets in the way. For example, you'll often find clinicians on busy NHS wards saying, I'd like to spend more time with my clients, my patients, but I've got too much paperwork. So that's, it's not I'm scared of it, it's that other things maybe are getting in the way and blocking me from being too busy.
Right? And is that physiology as well? Because I think for me, it's not really the first one, it's not often the second one, sometimes I'm pretty busy, but it's normally more like almost like a physiological thing, like I'm a little bit in that fight-flight mode. You know, so I'm stressed, I'm tired, and it's just harder for that social engagement system to kind of kick in almost neurologically at that point.
Yeah, so one of the bits that you're touching on there then is from a CFT point of view, we call this the threat system, and how your threat system isn't necessarily so orientated always to being in this compassionate, caring motivation. Now, the key thing about that is that we don't give ourselves a hard time if that's happened to us, that we've shifted from being a compassionate boss into someone who's less compassionate. It's more...
That's the word we're looking for.
Okay,
here.
we could go that far. But it's also then, so that's where self-compassion comes in. So number one is to notice that I've shifted here, to recognize that something's happened here, and to be curious, what has just happened inside of me? And so rather than berating myself, or rather than avoiding or not noticing it, can I tune in? What's just happened inside of me? What's caused me to do this? Is it because I'm too busy? Is it because I'm stressed? Is it because I'm tired? So you're sensitive to this. And then, of course, it's about, can I take responsibility? It's not my fault if I've shifted into something else. That's human. But do I want to be that version of me? Or the answer is no, then what do I need to do? What are the skills I need to develop to regulate myself so that I can shift more back into that position of being supportive and caring?
Yeah, I would say it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility as well, right? Because you know, you're a grown up, and if you're someone's boss, they don't give a shit that you haven't slept, you had a bad, bad day or whatever. You know, I'm still a grown up. It's still my responsibility to not be unpleasant to people. So, I mean, what are your top tips then? Because obviously, I teach centering. I find that very helpful. You know, long term, getting good night's sleep, eating well, mindfulness practices. You know, all the good things, right? But even with that, I think, like most people, I slip out of compassionate mode more than I'd like. Like, what are your kind of top wins or top tools to teach people?
Well, I suppose what I was thinking of then as you were talking, Mark, one of the things you mentioned was sleep. So, sometimes when we're kind of really, really stressed and things are quite, really difficult, or we kind of got mulling over something in the middle of the night, one of the things that I really like to do is something that we call like a calming, peaceful place imagery, or use memory. So we have the idea of the first and second psychologies of compassion. And the second psychologies of compassion are about things like, how can we use our memory and reasoning, our senses. So CFT can be actually really quite creative as well, and playful. So thinking about things like imagery, memory, kind of compassionate behavior, what would that look like? What would that look like if I was showing compassion to you, but also showing it to myself? What kind of things would I do? So it might be that it's acts of kindness. It might be that it's kind of self-compassion. In our new app, the self-compassion app, we've got a nice kind of session that focuses on a compassionate kit bag, where we kind of talk about things like smells and, kind of really getting in touch with our senses, and maybe even having photos or different things in that. But when things are difficult and things are tricky, that could potentially help us.
I've got your app. You plugged it a couple of times. We better say. So this is the people. It's just called Compassion. It's 3 little orange circles. If people are looking for it on the App Store.
And the self-compassion app. That's the actual full name.
That's what it's called. Elaine Beaumont. And there's different sessions on there for people. I mean, tell us like some of the main toolkit you're using. You mentioned a couple of things there, but I'd be like, what are your go-tos in your toolkit generally?
Well, one of the bits just to say here, Mark, is that we mentioned about the threat system earlier, which in some ways is, similar to, a couple of the levels of Porges' idea, fight and flight, and that whole sort of freeze and shutdown bit. But in CFT language, the sort of social engagement system is referred to as the soothing system. Now, the nice thing about these two models, folks, is they developed in parallel. They have been influenced by each other subsequently, but they were developed by 2 different genius brains in different places, different continents. Now, the thing about the soothing system is that very much links into oxytocin, the parasympathetic nervous system, and so on. So first off, we're going to need to cultivate the system. And the nice thing is that we know now through science that there's all sorts of things that we can do for that. So a major practice in CFT relates to, well, we call it soothing rhythm breathing. So it is partly about breathing rhythm, but it also involves posture. So how do we embody our posture in such a way which is upright and grounded? How do we begin to slow down our breathing rhythm so that we can stimulate this parasympathetic nervous system? How do we imagine or actually bring a friendly facial expression, carrying in a voice tone? So all of these things which can stimulate parasympathetic. So you're building capacity in the soothing system, which we know it regulates your threat system. It evolved to do this. So by cultivating that bit, that gives you the stability. That's almost like the foundations, mindfulness and those sort of things help too. The second thing I would say then in CFT is that we then deliberately cultivate your compassionate mind. Now, Elaine was touching on that, but a major practice in CFT is one called compassionate self. And this practice here is about, it doesn't matter whether you feel that you are or are not a compassionate figure, but if you were going to be you at your compassionate best, what qualities would you have? And then we add on to that. So we get people imagining that they have wisdom, that they understand that life is hard and that we have these difficult bodies and emotions and brains. That the second quality is strength. So a little bit like amazing leaders like Nelson Mandela and so on, they're not weak people, they're very strong people, like firefighters. That's an example we often use, Mark. Firefighter has a compassionate motive. They are noticing the person trapped in the burning building. That's the first bit of compassion. And number two, they take wise action. They skill themselves up to be able to save the person. But you would never describe a firefighter as weak or wishy-washy. There goes courage, there goes strength. So we can imagine and get you learning how to tolerate your own distress or somebody else's. And then the final quality is a caring commitment, a desire to be helpful, not harmful, to learn how to go about being competent in the way that we do it. And your listeners, of course, would have trained themselves in various ways to know how to alleviate distress. And so these are trainable qualities. And we do this practice through imagery, through embodiment, using acting techniques. We've got colleagues who are doing martial arts and CFT stuff. So the idea here is that how we then begin to cultivate and bring this into your life, we can do in multiple ways. But by doing so, we've got great studies showing that this changes your physiology, it lights up different patterns in your brain. But thirdly, it links to things like lower levels of shame, self-criticism, and of course, more caring and compassionate behaviors too.
You would have thought it. Compassion's good for you. And self-soothing too. Here's a tricky question then. Could you compassionately beat a child? So if I thought that that was good for the child, as I think many people do who, you know, use physical violence against their children, which I'm strongly against, just for the record. If you were to say, you know, this is a compassionate thing, I'm teaching them something really important, they're gonna grow up to be a better person because of this, would that still be a compassionate act or not?
I think the tricky thing there is about wisdom. So it's trying to understand wisdom. Why would beating a child be more helpful than teaching a child? Mm-hmm. And how much of that beating is about your own stuff rather than the child's stuff? Now, an example I would probably go to, which is the in-between version, is if your child is walking towards a plug socket with a metal fork in their hand, you ain't just going to have a soft voice tone and say, come here, my love, come and have a hug. Everything will be, no. Your compassionate action there is loud, you're quick. And when you get to your child, you might pull them back and maybe scare them a bit. But that's compassion because you're preventing suffering. That's okay. But when you're resorting to violence and beating a child rather than teaching a child about how they can manage something in a different way, yeah, that you've slipped from being compassionate, being helpful, not harmful. You are now actively being harmful, even if you have some part of you that's trying to do this for the good of the child. You are creating suffering by acting that way.
Sure, we don't know, right? Like,
I was just going to say, Mark, we have quite a nice example that we use within CFT, and it's really the idea of thinking about, you know, two teachers. You know, if we have one, you know, both teachers want maybe exactly the same thing, but the child's suffering, say, for example, with maths, and one teacher saying, I can help your child with the maths, and it's going to be, you know, it would be this way. You know, be soothing and calm and talking to the child and saying, you know, it's understandable. It's a new skill that you're learning. It's going to be tricky. It's going to be difficult. And you've got another teacher that's potentially more bullying. Everyone else can get it. Why can't you get it? You know, I'm keep having to spend time with you. Well, you know, the answer really is that we'd want the compassionate and kind and nurturing teacher, because that's how we're going to learn. And that's how we're going to move forward. And, you know, so I think that's a quite nice example that we often use within CFT. Both people want exactly the same outcome, but we just go about it in a different way.
People can learn this stuff as well, right? Like people can get better at these skills as well. I mean, that's a kind of a key piece here as well, right?
Yeah. You know, I often use the example that we don't just get the nicest, kindest, smiliest people off the street, throw them into a room with somebody with severe mental health distress and say, just be nice, you know, just smile. You know, we spend years training therapists about how to be with suffering. And it's the same, of course, for many people outside of psychotherapy who are doing, you know, helping jobs, you know, yogis and so on. You know, we know that it takes time to cultivate these skills. So this is one of the key things. This is trainable. The problem is that in many of our clinical trainings, whether it's nurses, doctors, psychologists, therapists, we don't actually spend that much time necessarily talking about what compassion is, what gets in the way of it, how you cultivate it, and how actually you manage your own distress as a way of course, helping other people. Now, we do touch on it a little bit, but actually, Elaine and I both talked about this before. During our trainings, very rarely did anybody mention the word compassion. Very rarely did anyone actually teach you, this is how you go about doing this thing. This is how we can actually cultivate it for yourself and for others.
And kind of adding on to that, Chris, I was thinking then about the work that we kind of both do a lot of work independently within the NHS. And, you know, a lot of people at the moment kind of feeling quite sort of self-critical and suffering with symptoms of burnout because of COVID and everything else that's been kind of going on. And so we've started kind of teaching a lot of these skills. Like I run a compassion focused therapy module at the university, and, you know, kind of teaching these things and self-care. But actually outside of education, a lot of things are happening, you know, like with COVID, and there's so much more of a need to help people to cultivate compassion, because, you know, people in the healthcare professions are really struggling right now. You know, a lot of people are on the knees with everything that's been going on.
Full on, it's full on. It's a bit weird, isn't it, that we need you guys. Don't get me wrong, I'm very glad you exist and you do this work, but it sort of shows to me that society is a bit sick, if you ask me, that we need to have special words. And, you know, surely any parent in the world would kind of get co-regulation intuitively. I see cultures that are better, like I'm in the Mediterranean, you see a lot of co-regulation here and community and connection. It's just, you're not more than England, generally. And it strikes me we're a bit sick that we've had to kind of science this up. We've had to sort of justify human compassion with brain studies, and it's a bit odd, isn't it?
But we do kind of have a tendency as human beings to go more for the self-critical than the self-compassion. You know, so even something simple like noticing kind of the language that we use, or the tone of voice that we use with our, you know, we live with ourselves 365 days a year, you know, yet often we can be quite tough with the way that we talk to ourselves, and we certainly often wouldn't talk to somebody else the way we talk to ourselves. So even something like this, it's not just about compassion, it's about, you know, saying to people, look, we all do this. Let's all try and be mindful of our language and our voice tone. And
yeah, here's one for you. You might not have, good for Manchester. I call it the pub punch in the face test. So if I find myself talking to myself in a way that if someone else in the pub talked to me that way, I would punch them in the face, then I don't do it. That's a little rule of thumb that I have. So,
but I think this is important, Mark, because I mean, what we need to distinguish though is compassion outwards and compassion inwards. From my side of things, if all of this stuff, if it was all so straightforward, then actually we wouldn't have any abusive parents. If you look at the stats on this, the level of abuse that there is, and sexual abuse from parents to children, is shocking.
Yeah.
The point is, this brain of ours is a bit of a fucking mess. And actually, we need this stuff, the science on it, the brain scans, the therapy stuff, because human beings cause the most immense suffering to other human beings and to other animals. That is the reality. Inside this head of ours is pernicious and callous and cruel stuff. And so CFT actually is about compassion, how we promote it, but it's also thinking about and looking into the dark side to recognize that human beings can be the most compassionate and caring, but they can also be massively callous. And so there's lots of CFT work going on now in forensic populations, working with people who have done some pretty horrible things to other human beings. And you see, if you don't understand both of these aspects, of course, it sounds like it's a sort of sanitized story. You know, this is just simple, it's straightforward, we don't need a science for this. Well, actually we do, because throughout the nature of, or through the history of human beings, even just our last 100 odd years of, you know, Nazi Germany, awful wars, slavery, terrible things that we still see playing out, awful treatment of women, abuse and murder, and these terrible things. This is inside human beings. So how do we understand this? And how do we work hard then by understanding it to try to promote a more caring and compassionate way of being in our cultures? But then the second bit is inside our own heads, which is what you and Elaine were talking about. We tend to have this thing in which we teach children amazing things, science, geography and maths. But when do we actually teach children explicitly how to be caring and supportive to themselves, how to deal with the most important thing, which is sat inside of here, which is, for many of us, can cause us all sorts of pain. So in one way, you're right. I wish we weren't here. I wish that this stuff was so normal, you didn't really have to think about it or teach it or research it. But the reality is, sadly, human beings are actually pretty, or can be pretty horrible creatures. And so therefore, actually, we need this, and we have always needed this. Actually, if you look back in human cultures, there were wonderful examples of compassion. But gosh, if you look at the awful way that human beings can treat each other, which in one way is not our fault. We do not choose to have the capacity to be harmful. We have evolved to have some of these abilities too, but there is a choice at some stage. How do we want our culture to be? And as an individual, how do I want to be with this?
Yeah, it does seem to be getting better as well. I'm on the sort of Steven Pinker side of this, you know, like it does seem to be that there's a slight leaning growth over time towards a bit more compassion. You know, the fact that we do find slavery repugnant now, even if it still does exist in some places, you know, that's fairly recent. You know, It's fairly recent that we don't abuse people for their sexuality, even in the UK. It's pretty recent that most people think that way now. It does seem like there's a positive movement. I mean, it's very easy to be sort of doom and gloom in the current world, but you read the, you know, something like the Old Testament. It's like, and then we killed all the men and raped all the women, and enslaved all the kids. Next chapter, I'm like, hang on a minute, you know what? Well, you did what? What? Just Babylon or something? You know, like it does seem like it's become less acceptable to do stuff like that.
Well, it's true, but what we would argue though is it depends on context. So we know from all sorts of recent history, if you look at the war in Rwanda, you had people living next door to each other from different tribes who historically had some difficulties, but you get a change in the context. The plane was shot down with the president on, before you know what's happening, people doing the most heinous things to their neighbors. And I guess the point here is that although I agree with you that we are making progress in lots of areas, unfortunately, actually, we changed the context on people. For example, we know in the UK when our to-be Prime Minister, or actually was Prime Minister at that time, described Muslim women as walking around looking like letterboxes and used some defamatory language, there was something like a 300% increase in Islamophobic attacks in that following week. The point is that context matters. It changes how people's brains work. And so we always have to be quite vigilant that actually it's not just going to be a linear progression, but actually there can be very quick shifts into people actually treating each other pretty horribly. So I agree with you, your broad point, Mark, but it's tricky because this brain of ours actually changes very quickly depending on the context of what it's placed.
Sure. Yeah, it's both. Huh? It's both. And how do we get this out? Like, I mean, you've done this app, that seems pretty cool. Like, therapy is expensive. Not many people can do it. I'd love to see a shift where this becomes, you know, more of a normal thing to talk about compassion skills. And, you know, like, even like imagine going to a job and they're like, okay, how's your Excel spreadsheet? Okay, do you speak French? And how are your compassion skills? You know, like, is it just a competency that, like, have you passed your driving test? You know, it's like a competency that we can up from the very basic level that's normally existing. How do we make that a normal thing in the wider world? Because therapy one-on-one ain't going to do it, is it?
No. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just thinking then as you were talking, Mark, thinking about actually, you know, trying to teach more of this stuff in schools to start with. Actually, a lot of young people, you know, could teach us a thing or two, you know, a lot of kids. But teaching some of this stuff in schools, definitely. I think the good thing is with, you know, kind of going back to the app, that, you know, the app is kind of, you know, that could potentially be used to help people who have kind of maybe come out of therapy or who can't afford therapy. There's often discounts that we might be able to have with the app. The Compassionate Mind workbook's a step-by-step guide to cultivating compassion. But both Chris and I also do lots of work for charities. So we try and give back to our communities in different ways. So, you know, I'm not just motivated by kind of working with people that, you know, can pay for therapy. You know, there's that kind of idea for most of us as psychotherapists that we would have a sliding fee scale. Now, that's difficult when people are working for the NHS and not everybody will want private therapy. But there are options out there, although there is, nothing is perfect.
A really interesting thing for me is, Mark, as you say, and you, Elaine, if I spent every single hour of my working week, let's say I did 50 hours and I saw 50 clients a week, and I worked until I was 75, I'm going to see a drop in the ocean of people. And so it's not to say I love being a therapist and a clinical psychologist, but actually that's not the place to do the work. We try, don't we, to get further upstream. I mean, if there's some pollution in the river somewhere, and you then go and spend a lot of time trying to extract the pollution and clean up the river, but you haven't seen that it's because this power plant is pumping this stuff out 2 miles upstream, you're going to have to keep on just working with this downstream stuff. We need to go upstream. And so both of your points is, how do we get this in earlier? So colleagues of ours are doing compassionate mind training programs in schools, both for teachers and for kids. So how do we teach this, as you say, Mark, as a skill? Why? I think it's fascinating that as our culture, we emphasize certain types of learning and elevate it, like maths and sciences and English and all the rest of it. That's fine. But again, it's a quirk of history that we don't teach people the skills to deal with the thing they're going to need the most, which is how to manage psychological difficulties, ups and downs in life. That is the thing. It's only a quirk, really, that it's not taught, because it easily could have done. Historically, if somebody had actually come up and said, you know what, alongside this science and math stuff, actually what you're going to need in life to help you to live a better life are these skills. And of course, in certain parts of the world,
we just haven't replaced religion.
Well, I think it's tricky, because religion has and hasn't. It depends on what religion, and it depends on how explicit the skills have been taught. A lot of people haven't actually been taught how to do this, even within religions. Maybe Buddhism would be the closest in terms of the amount of time you're spent cultivating your mind in and for compassion. But most people's experience of religion wasn't actually in being taught how to be and do this necessarily in a skillful, ongoing way, and certainly not how to do it to yourself. It's been maybe about others, be kind and caring. Yeah, religions have talked about that. But we haven't really ever had a situation in which we're teaching how to do this on the inside, how to deal with your own difficulties, your own anger, your own rage, your own shame, your own grief. That's the stuff that we need to be teaching kids as well.
All right. Is there anything we haven't touched upon that you'd like to mention before we sort of go to the wrap up here? Big areas of your work.
Well, I guess only for me, really, if people want to learn more about this, really, one of the things that we would say is that a beauty, and I am biased, of course, of compassion-focused therapy is the way that you do that therapy, the way that you try to alleviate someone's distress can be done in lots of different ways. So we've got wonderful projects going on now of CFT with yoga, CFT in martial arts, lots of CFT-based body-based embodiment work as well. So just to say to your listeners, there's all sorts of different ways other than just sort of sat in a chair opposite somebody else. And the whole point here is that CFT is a multimodal therapy. So just like there are many ways to get to the center of London, I can walk, I can get a bus and a train or a tube. They all take me there, but I can go different routes. It's similar with CFT. There are lots of different ways that you can work with someone's distress that aren't just about the sort of typical therapeutic sat in a chair in front of somebody for 50 minutes. And so I'd really encourage people just to check out some of the resources that you can find. There's various places you can do that on our website, Balanced Minds, so it's www.balancedminds.com. But also the Compassionate Mind Foundation. That's the charity that sits behind compassion-focused therapy. So if people look up that, there are wonderful resources to help people who are interested in this from all sorts of different professional backgrounds, because actually many of us own the same motive. We share the same motive. We want to be helpful. We want to alleviate distress. And CFT hopefully has a way, both theoretically and scientifically, but also in terms of what to do, that might sit very nicely for clinicians and also non-clinicians too.
Thank you. Elaine, any way you want to point people to as well?
I think a great resource is the Compassionate Mind Foundation website. My website is www.beaumontpsychotherapy.co.uk. A bit of a mouthful. Beaumont apparently means beautiful mountain in French. Not that I'm French, but, and if anybody's interested in any of the work that we kind of do research-wise as well, or want more information about the work we do, please contact us. We both of us always happy to help out where we can, or at least point people in the right direction. So, yeah.
Well, thank you both, and thank you for your work too. Incredibly positive stuff to be putting out there, and I'd like to see a kinder world too. So, power to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Cheers.
Thanks, Mark.